Hello there, John Culturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining us for this episode. As per usual, thank you to everybody who makes this work possible. In today's episode, it's my pleasure to welcome Kouta Hernandez in the United States to talk to us about two particularly important topics in science, the file drawer effect and the replication crisis. But before we proceed, please allow me to remind our audience that nothing that you find on the internet or in the media is advice. If you ever have concerns of any nature about yourself or somebody else, please seek advice from a professional or someone else that you trust. And if you're in Australia and seeking counselling from me, please find my contact details in the description of this episode. Kouta, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. Kouta, tell us a bit about yourself.
So I'm originally from the island of Guam, and then following graduating high school, I went into the U.S. Armed Forces. I was a Marine. My MOS was in the field of aviation ordnance, and so I worked directly to maintain the weapon systems for the F-18, as well as occasionally handling munitions, transporting them. And then after my service ended, I decided to pursue my degree. During my time in undergrad, I took one intro to psych class and I was instantly hooked. And from there, I decided to pursue psychology as my major, and I just graduated in December.
Excellent. Congratulations, Kouta, and I'm sure that your range of life experiences will definitely stand you in good stead with whatever you choose to do in life. Now, you being interested in scientific psychology, the issues of the replication crisis and the file drawer effect are particularly relevant because they seem to be particularly concerned in the fields of health sciences and social sciences. So to give our audience a basis, the replication crisis is an issue by which a large number of studies have attempted to be reproduced through similar methodology, and the outcomes themselves don't match what the original researchers achieved, which brings into question how valid or how reliable those original research methods or those original results were. And it effectively raises a sense of uncertainty of, can we really trust that what this study teaches us about the world is true? The file drawer effect refers to the tendency of some scientific institutions to try to hide or draw attention away from results that aren't particularly exciting, so to speak, or that don't provide particularly titillating results. It appears that certain institutions, certain environments are looking for results that are particularly surprising or agitate a particular amount of excitement amongst people. Where would you like to begin on this topic? Tell us, where can we go from here?
So to start out, I do want to make it clear I've never published in a scientific journal. However, I do have experience doing an independent study directly under a professor. I spent an entire semester writing a giant paper on family unpredictability. One of the reasons I was kind of reluctant to even want to consider pushing it up was, one, I thought it was rather amateurish. Me, little old undergrad me, trying to publish among like doctoral candidates or people who have done dissertations. But part of that was also because with the results of our study, right? So I actually went to the College of Charleston, and the primary demographic there are people who come from pretty well off socioeconomic statuses. And so with that, our results did not really bring out anything new. And then there's also the issue of the sample not fully reflecting the population. But it's really good, though, that we do recognize that. We didn't try to, partake in any sort of p-hacking to try to push a result, right? So going through my cognitive psychology class, that is a very important point that was brought up, was it's really hard to try to get some sort of like theory going, especially in, social science, especially in psychology, because you're running into these issues where it is very possible that, some sort of data manipulation could have happened. I'm not saying it does all the time. I'm not saying it's a very common occurrence, but it's bad when there are actual retraction trackers online for psychological studies. And then that also ties into, well, why would someone be pushed to, commit some sort of data hacking, right? And from there, it's because you don't want to fall victim to the file drawer effect. Because it seems, talking to my professors who are actively trying to publish, it seems that the threshold to be able to publish seems to be pretty high. And if these publications are wanting to put their name on the line, they'd want to see some sort of positive effect. Because they're looking for that positive effect, they're not really inclined to wanting to publish replications of studies that either A, didn't work, or B, just might have disproven, a very famous study. And then we also look at that in when you bring up, past very, very famous psychology studies, right? Everyone swears up and down like, oh my gosh, this is the coolest psychology thing ever. But then when you really look into the methodology, you see a lot of flaws. If your result is contingent on a very, very specific set of circumstances and they fail to generalize, is it really that, significant of a result? So yeah, no, I'm just glad that even in the undergrad world, they're already starting to prepare us for this. And I just like to think that, it's setting up the future of psychology to be able to have a little more credibility, because, the running joke among the majors would be, it's just, oh, it's a soft science. And people tend to forget, no, psychology is a data-driven science. It's because a lot of what you see in pop culture really just pushes this idea that, oh, I could do all of these crazy things and manipulate people and be able to make so many sales and all of that using psychology. But really, it's a lot more statistics based than people realize. And when the statistics are bad, it really does not help that it would cause, it would just cause the whole thing to fall apart, right? So good science is contingent on gathering good evidence, and good evidence is contingent on ethical and proper data collection and good stats.
Those are a number of interesting points. And first of all, I'm glad that your own mentors and your undergraduate studies were preparing you for this in themselves, making sure that they didn't inadvertently bias their studies or try to have too much of a personal vested interest, and instead focus their work on actually achieving results that were in the best interest of the scientific community and the best interest of society at large by extension. Science can lose its credibility when it's not practiced well. And to really to understand this better, we have to understand what the basis of science actually is, because too many people, ironically enough, although I don't want to judge anyone, but at the same time, we have to be aware of this particular bias, that ironically, a lot of people who say trust the science don't realize that they're exercising their own bias when they have an impression in their mind of what science is, but don't realize that science is more than what we assume it is. So to understand what science actually is, as we know, we have to understand why we need the methodology. Human beings don't perceive objective reality perfectly. There are flaws and distortions in the way that we process information. The point of science is to try to discover information in the world in as objective and logical a manner as possible, using methods that minimize the impact of human bias. So we use numbers, we use sampling paradigms to ensure that the people who are involved in a study, or the objects, if it's not human related, are as close to representative as how they are in the real world as possible. We use methods such as blinding to ensure that when a person interprets a result, they're not unduly influenced by other aspects of a study in which they've been involved. We ensure that the human participants in the study are perhaps shielded from the true purpose of the study, of course, in an ethical manner. There are ethics around that, but ensuring that they are not unduly giving the answers that they think they are expected to give. We have all these different norms, all these different paradigms to ensuring that we're only collecting data from and interpreting what is objectively happening, not what is happening in our minds. That's the purpose of science. If we accept that and we truly embody it, then what we can logically conclude from that is, even if a result doesn't seem particularly exciting, for example, if we are expecting to get a particular result where our hypothesis or our prediction is confirmed, and instead our hypothesis is disproven, what people seem to forget for some reason I just can't fathom is that that is still information. That still teaches us something. It teaches us what you thought was not necessarily true. That could mean that an alternative answer is the truth. So that eliminates one possible answer and then can orient us towards seeking answers elsewhere.
Most things in psychology are kind of tied to be able to want to help people down the road, right? Especially because, clinical psychology, it requires the use of scientific backed information to be able to help people. And so if we really aren't having the best possible information, what harm could that also cause to, patients or clients or just people down the road, right? It's kind of like, how do we know that today's CBT isn't going to be tomorrow's phrenology if we don't know that there is a chance it might not work, but people don't tend to think about that because it's never usually published. What we usually see is positive feature. We got to be able to understand that, hey, it's okay that it doesn't work all the time. And that just adds to the toolbox so that we can help people if, for some reason one treatment doesn't work. We have some sort of reasoning as to why. And then if we really dig into, okay, well, why didn't this generalize to this population? We wouldn't apply this therapy there.
It raises a number of other important issues. First of all, in the audiences beyond the scientific community, such as general audiences who consume mainstream media, if a news article ever mentions a scientific outcome, it'll almost always mention a positive result, especially when it's regarding an issue that is not widely reported otherwise. There are a number of reasons for that. Number one, the job of a news outlet is to sell their media. So they want to sell articles that people are going to want to read. If you title an article CBT found to be ineffective, it wouldn't happen. We know that it's effective under in the right circumstances. But if we, for example, hypothetically found a result that's cognitive behavioral therapy was an ineffective form of treatment for depression, who would read that? It'd just make people who are already depressed perhaps feel a little bit more hopeless that there's no treatment available for what they're experiencing. But if you instead title the article CBT found to be extra effective for treating depression, it gives people hope. And so people will want to read that because it presents something that is assumed by the wording of it to be a new finding, to be a new discovery. And by nature, we are very much predisposed to seeking novelty. In the general scientific community, we would like to think that scientists understand that this is a cognitive flaw and actively avoid it, but evidently, as we're discussing now, it doesn't necessarily happen that way. It's also important to realize that even if something is an established result, we need to have the freedom to question it in the appropriate circumstances, because, as you've said, just because a particular setup with a particular set of research circumstances produce a particular result, numbers themselves are incredibly useful, but they can't capture the complexity of the real world. So we also have to have the freedom to ask, yes, but does it generalize to this circumstance or to that circumstance? If I am to use cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT as it's called, in this particular client population, is it likely to produce the same results as it did in that study? All too often, our responses to these types of questions are, well, let's find more numbers to try to demonstrate or disprove our point. But ultimately, what science also has to be is humble, and it has to realize that it can't replicate real-world complexity. Sometimes only real-world human ingenuity can actually solve certain problems with science supporting it. Without the scientific basis, humans have very little on which to be able to confidently argue a particular idea. But once you have that basis, there needs to be freedom to be more flexible beyond it and say, once we have the strong mathematical basis, we need to know how to use our own ingenuity and our own intuition in knowing when and how to apply certain ideas and when to avoid applying them.
And so this is where it gets kind of difficult, right? So it seems to be a very big consensus, enough of a consensus that we are actually taught in the classroom about the replication crisis. But then when you turn around, as with most problems, right, especially within the political landscape, it's like, okay, yes, we can agree this is bad, but how would we fix it? Right. And so then you have to kind of consider, okay, well, why would something be a pet theory? Because that might essentially be what pushes people to want to have to like prove their pet theory, right? Could it be like a sunk cost fallacy kind of thing where I'm not too sure what the publication process is like, right? But say you are a professor at a university, and this is at least how it works out here in the States is, all right, well, hey, you're a professor, we are paying you. Yes, you're teaching, but you're also supposed to be researching, right? So that's why people go on sabbaticals and stuff. But what happens when all of that funding and all of your grants are sunk into you just for you to come out with a negative result or a result that's not strong enough to want to be published? Then, we can see how someone's ego might get hurt, or they start to feel some sort of imposter syndrome because it was like, hey, I couldn't replicate or I couldn't prove a theory that I really felt would push me into the stratosphere within academia. So then it's like, what would the symptoms be, and how could we how could we fix this crisis? Because ultimately we want to have the best information to be able to give the best treatment to have the best outcomes for people, right? So if that's the ultimate goal, why isn't there more of a push to really looking into the bones as to why this is happening?
That's a good question. We can't speak for every scientist or every institution, so this is something of a generalization, but I would maintain it's a truism. Seeking power and fame have psychological bases that are completely at odds with the true purposes of science. This is something that I've discussed quite extensively in my work before, but when we seek power or we seek control or we seek some kind of notoriety that allows us a significant amount of influence in society, in almost every case, it involves going against natural order. It involves going against what is good for society as a whole, because the psychology of trying to seek influence involves egocentrism. It involves looking at your own personal desires and your own personal biases and taking them to be applicable to the situation. It prioritizes that hedonistic feeling of, oh my gosh, I have control, I have influence, this feels so good. Science is the complete opposite. It's not supposed to be based on an individual's desires. It's meant to be based on what exists in objective reality, which then society can use for its greater good. I'm sure plenty of scientists out there have integrity, and they will absolutely maintain their scientific principles and even be willing to lose their jobs if they are told either find the results that we want you to find or we'll dismiss you. But of course, they never get influence in society because people are effectively brainwashed to think, well, this scientist has all these credentials, which are of course socially constructed. This scientist has all this notoriety. They must be right. Otherwise, how would they have such notoriety? It's the same sector of society that tends to say, trust the science. Well, if you knew science, you'd also know not just chemistry and physics and biology, but also psychology, which if you look at psychological analysis of all of history, you will find a consistent outcome that people who seek power in an extreme sense, not only are they mentally corrupted and have done horrible things to society, but also trust the science has been a tagline that is used to perform some horrible, absolutely horrible things on people. So just because someone has the label scientist on it, it doesn't mean that objectively what they have in mind is society's best interest. Some people are so disturbed that they will seek a particular qualification and a particular position that is meant to be associated with humility and goodness, just so that they can have a sense of control. Think about all the instances of doctors or other allied health professionals abusing their patients. That doesn't happen by accident. They're doing that because they get something from it. They get a sick sense of power from it. So it's important to realize that when a result comes from a particularly credible source, you also have to question, yes, but did that person actually get there because they objectively found an answer that could be useful, or were they told, hey, you'd better find the results that we're paying you to find, or bad things could happen to you in terms of your career, in terms of your reputation? And you're right, there's a question of how do you solve it? As a counsellor, I receive referrals from others, and I also like to help my audience become aware of resources and other providers which may be beneficial, as well as help other individuals and organisations gain exposure. That's why I host the Your Listener Partner Network, and I'd like to thank my partners for their support. I'd like to introduce Jebeli Positive Pathways. Jebeli Positive Pathways is an NDIS registered provider specialising exclusively in positive behaviour support. They support children, young people and adults with disability who experience behaviours of concern, using evidence-based, person-centred and trauma-informed approaches. Their work focuses on understanding the functions of behaviour, reducing restrictive practices, and building meaningful skills and improving quality of life. They collaborate closely with families, support workers, schools, and services to ensure strategies are practical, consistent, and sustainable across everyday settings. Find them at www.jebelipositivepathways.com.au.
On the contrary to what I have been saying, I also do want to mention where it is a good thing that we have these safeguards and thresholds, right? So because we live in a time of so much information, there's also just as much misinformation, and then when confirmation bias ties into it, and you just see people like, oh, hey, I have a question for Google. which is I could go through 100 results that null or that prove null, but it's like no. Here, result 101 agrees with me, so therefore it's got to be true, right? And so these safeguards kind of help us filter, and we also can't just publish every single failure as well. We still want positive effect, right? We still want to publish positive effect, but it's like, okay, well, we understand that 100 ways don't work and it is still valid. We only have so much space to be able to publish to begin with, and then when you look into actual articles, you see, okay, there's always going to be a conflict of interest statement, right? But then when I asked my professor, it's like, hey, if I were to lie on my conflict of interest, yes, it's unethical, but it's like, is there some sort of way I could get caught down the road? What would happen if like, hey, conflict of interest, but I don't disclose it, and then just like, somewhere down the road, it gets discovered, but it's been around for so long where we just kind of have this bias to believe that, oh, because it's such an old, it's such an old truth, right? Quote unquote truth. How would we counteract that? You know what I mean? Where it's like, hey, it's been around for so long, but then it turned out that there was a conflict of interest. What sort of accountability could possibly come from that with all the damage that it might have caused? You know what I mean? And you see that a lot with, okay, this is very anecdotal, but when you think about, the prior studies with the big tobacco, right? Where it's like, hey, yeah, my doctors recommend smoking this brand of cigarettes or that brand of cigarettes. And it's like, okay, but who was funding the study? And now, like, even in, like, if you're going through some sort of database, like publication database, you also got to kind of consider, it's like, what is this trying to push? And who could have possibly sponsored it? Because not everybody, I don't believe every single person who's publishing an article is doing it off grants and academic like honor alone, And so that's where it's, who's to say you have to fully disclose, and how can we actually prove someone has no true conflict of interest in their study once it's published?
Those are excellent questions, and truth be told, whenever you have any type of institutional setting, it's impossible to know whether all the truths that are stated in terms of the administration of the study and the creation of the outcome, it's impossible to know if all truths are accurate. In terms of the room that we have for publication of studies that produce a negative result as opposed to a positive result, so to speak, would it be practical to come to a convention by which, if a small number of researchers have tried to replicate a particular study and found that they achieved the same result, that their hypothesis was disproven, would it then be possible to then take that outcome and use it as a basis to reject further replication, perhaps, to say, we've already tried this a few times and we've always achieved the same results, so let's try something different instead of trying to replicate it again?
Yeah, and then I guess, that is one solution, right? But I feel if you have enough people disproving one topic, that's how we ended up in the replication crisis. Because it's like, hey, enough people spoke out and was like, I emailed or tried to contact the original author of the study, and I was trying to ask them what I did wrong. And then maybe you might be able to get a group of people together. It's kind of like a class action lawsuit kind of deal, right? Where if enough people say, hey, this doesn't work, you might be able to shift it where it's like, okay, so now we know it doesn't work, rather than accepting it as gospel. But it's how would you be able to contact other people that have failed to replicate if you're not getting published? Because of the file drawer effect, for all we know, this could have, like, that could have very well happened where this ran, hundreds of times, failed hundreds of times, but because it never got released that, hey, this treatment or this, this hypothesis has been disproven, people, like, would we just be doomed to constantly trying to replicate it, not realizing that it's a Sisyphean task? You know what I mean?
That's right, which may be in reference to our conventions in science, that we may feel or think at times that we have to constantly know the answer to something. And so there may well be a large number of people trying to establish what went wrong in my attempt to replicate this study. Why did I not achieve the results as the original researcher? And one must ask, does there come a time at which you have to cut your losses and say, it's just not worth trying to pursue this anymore? Maybe if I want to know an answer to a question in this domain, perhaps it's best that I wrote my own study and attempted to overcome what I believe to be the shortcomings of other studies and then go from there so that I'm working from a clean basis where I'm not trying to replicate something else and likely finding it to be hopeless or futile. I'm actually working from a completely new basis whereby I'm inputting what I believe to be the case and then testing that using a methodology that I have personally verified and know to be sound.
There could also just be, the question of, okay, well, what if we have some sort of universal, like, certifying body, right? Where, okay, if you have like failures to replicate and you send it, would it just go into its own class of like, okay, hey, in this specific thing, there was this many failures to replicate, this many examples of replication. But then that kind of puts us in danger of, if we only have one source of like information that's credible, who's to say that can't get corrupted down the road as well? That's why it's a very, very hard to be able to say anything is a hard and fast rule or theory within the realm of psychology, because at the end of the day, you cannot randomly assign people to, especially when you're looking in the world of clinical psychology, I can't just randomly assign a person to be depressed, because then that's a whole other can of worms where it's like, if random assignment is key and a necessity for causal statements, it's like, in the world of psychology, it would just prove to be a lot more difficult, unless, maybe like positive psychology, right? It's like, oh, I would love to be like, assigned to the happy group, but when it comes to, you can't just assign someone to be in like, the anxiety group or like depression. You can't give them that. And so you're really just trying to find your evidence via, questionnaires through like self-reporting or case studies. And even then, case studies and archival studies can be kind of limited, because when something is on the black and white of paper, you're not really seeing the nuance of the person either, Hopefully this can get more traction and just a larger body of scientists can actually start moving towards, okay, well, how else can we refine the process to be able to, one, prevent the file drawer effect within reason. Like I said, you can't just publish hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of failures, right? Because then it's just, you're taking away from, or you're adding more water to an ocean when you're trying to find like a single drop. But hopefully, because it's being brought up now, it should give people hope, at least within academia, that, hey, the future of, our beloved art, like our science and art, is just, it's in good hands, because now we're really starting to consider these questions where we really do want to operate on the good of everybody. And to do that, we really have to own up to, hey, our method isn't perfect. It's great, but I'm sure it could always be better. But that's life in general, right? Like, something can always be better some way, somehow.
On the issue of establishing an international authority to regulate the conducting of studies and the publication of the results of those studies, I would say that it is practically guaranteed that it would be corrupted somehow if it was to establish, because the people who know that the mind is easily corruptible would avoid taking that as a solution because they know of the dangers of it. And the people who are genuinely seeking power for the wrong reasons will say, yeah, sounds like a great idea. We get more power. What could be more important in life? Which to people who are that way inclined, unfortunately, that's how they see the world. I would say that in terms of the solution, I think we have more of a solution already than we may assume otherwise. The scientific method in itself, which has existed for a long time, is already robust. What we need to revise is not necessarily the scientific method, but our own psychology in terms of how we perceive it and how we understand it and what we do with it. So we could continue using the scientific method, but decide ourselves on ways to avoid using it in a biased fashion. And in the final analysis, I would say it has to do with our willingness to humble ourselves and decide that we are going to put science and objective reality first, and not let our personal desires influence the process. And there are ways that a person can do that, usually with the assistance of somebody else checking them to ensure that their activities are not too imbued with personal bias. But we have to decide for ourselves, I am genuinely not going to pursue personal satisfaction in this. I'm just going to pursue what is likely to be the truth, and I'm going to let the methodology provide the basis to discover that truth. I'm not going to try to sneak in my own agenda. And it's obviously easier said than done, because even if an individual decides that that should be the right outcome, an institution will always override it, because institutions exist on that basis. They try to seek more power, they try to maintain control. So it's not going to be easy to achieve, but that said, the answers are there. People, if everybody decided we are going to do what is in society's best interests, they could do it. It's just a matter of, do they want to? I'm not so much saying that it should fall only on the little man, so to speak, the person on the ground who's perhaps just entered the research field and is working largely under the authority of their supervisors and the institutions who sponsor the research. Even if they want to, they may be very much repressed in how much they can do. So I'm not so much blaming them, but more to say that if everybody from the chief executive officers at the top of those and the presidents at the top of those institutions who ultimately have the power to make the decisions, all the way down to the person on the ground floor, everyone has to basically make the same decision. We will do what is in society's best interests. That is possible. We have the capacity as human beings to do that. But in the realms of practicality, it relies on everybody doing it, not just the person on the bottom, because the person on the bottom could very easily be overridden if they try to break convention.
I'm really glad you bring up, where when you having to account for, the more people are involved in an institution, it's just that is so many more variables you have to account for. And it kind of reminds me of so on kind of like branching off now, right? I remembered I'd taken a psychology and pseudoscience class where, very interesting topics. A lot of it has to do with, okay, why certain types of pseudoscience are believed and taken for gospel, and also as well as conspiracies, right? And then when it comes down to conspiracies, the one of the biggest things that have been brought up as to why a lot of them wouldn't work is you're relying on so many people to keep one thing secret. And, I guess you could bring up, oh, well, what about NDAs? What about like this, that, or the other? But it's like, okay, well, what if, the reward is a lot better than the punishment, where say like, okay, yeah, I could do a tell-all book and violate an NDA if it means, I'll be able to make up for it after, getting my story told. But yeah, it's just that's also the challenge. The more people are involved in something, would it be like better to like vet on the ground floor better, and then just making sure that people with very strong ethics and good moral standing are the ones moving up? But then we see like throughout history that that's not always the case either.
I know this is somewhat tangential, but I want to respond to one of the ideas that you expressed from your class on the psychology of pseudoscience. One of the dangerous aspects of science is that it can actually become as much of a cult or belief system as the cults and belief systems that it claims to be better than and claims to criticize. At an implicit level, all of us have an unconscious recognition that life is quite dangerous and that one day we're all going to die, and that we can suffer, and that we can have horrible things come to us, and we can see horrible things come to other people. And evolutionary and trauma theories state that if we were to be aware of that to the full extent that it exists all the time, we would be so distracted by the anxiety that we wouldn't be able to survive. And so at an unconscious level, we effectively self-pacify by various psychological tactics that distract us from the dangers of life. One of the manifestations of those tactics is belief systems, because belief systems provide us with a simple black and white orderly framework through which to perceive the world, and they create the illusion that everything makes sense, it neatly fits together, and everything follows one line of logic. And if I just follow that one line of logic, then everything will work in life. And what happens from that as a consequence is anything that violates that, and we see this when we see rivalry between religions, philosophies, political groups, is whenever something violates that, it gives us an unconscious sense that the truth that we assume to be so may actually not be true. And so again, to distract us from the possibility that life is more complicated than we assume it is, we become defensive against that opposition and say those people are the enemy. And that's basically the basis from all political opposition throughout history. One person wanting to believe that their opinion is true because it creates a sense of safety, and it negates having to consider maybe there's more out there than I am actually acknowledging. Science can actually fall subject to that same problem, and sometimes scientists will make those kinds of arguments, such to say, it's impossible for conspiracy theories to be true because how could this many people actually keep a conspiracy going? It happens. Like literally every nation in history that has been politicized in some way, and by politicized I mean barring for traditional cultures that still live out in the wild where they still have their traditional societal structures. In the Western world where we have contemporary politics and economics, you could say that that whole institution, that like this whole Western culture in many ways is one big conspiracy, because we have people with a lot of power that they misuse, people with a lot of money, more money than they could actually spend, and more money than what they actually need. And I'm not, I'm not suggesting that capitalism or socialism are ideal constructs here. I'm just making sort of statements of fact that the richest people in the world couldn't use all that money. There are all these different belief systems stating they're the right ones, and yet there are exactly the same cognitive flaws present in all of them, and yet people still fall subject to believing them. So you could say, yeah, there is one big conspiracy, and we're the ones perpetuating it because we choose not to risk thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe what I believe is just an illusion, and maybe there's something more to life than what my teacher or politicians or the news tell me there is. So whether particular conspiracy theories are true or not is a big question to have to answer. Could a large number of people maintain a conspiracy? Absolutely. We're doing it right. A lot of us are doing it right now. All of us could be potentially a part of something that we're not even aware exists. In conclusion, that's a real danger of any framework through which we perceive the world. It becomes its own self-justifying dogma, and then we don't question it. That's where the scientific method has its weak point, that yes, it provides a basis on which to eliminate human bias so that we perceive objectivity as much as possible. But what can also happen from then on is it precludes a lot of the phenomena that exist in the world that can't be measured in numbers. And that's how we come to these kinds of problems. Not exactly like the file drawer effect or the replication crisis, but problems in which science starts to show weakness, or it starts to show its weak points as an institution. And those are the points where we have to say maybe what we assume to be the truth isn't necessarily the truth. Maybe we have to be willing to break the rules of understanding in order to properly understand this issue.
And that's the beauty of all of this, right? Is like, can there be dogma? Yes. Can there be some sort of corruption even in institutions we hope would never ever be corruptible? Absolutely there could be. But, the nature of science itself still will allow us to be able to disprove that, right? Even if it's on the ground level, hey, I know that I couldn't replicate this, but at least I know that to some extent, if I do it this exact way, it wouldn't work. And then it just kind of becomes a matter of, okay, now what are the stakes? Like me not telling anybody that it doesn't work this certain way, would that cause undue harm for, a greater amount of people, or would it just hurt my ego? You know what I mean? And so that's why this is such a noble pursuit, especially as as human beings, right? This is our noble pursuit, is being able to ask these questions, being able, even if we might not have the tools immediately, we might not have the greatest labs, we might not have any funding. It's at the end of the day, all of this boils down, to every single person at some point in their life looking at a problem or some sort of phenomenon, some sort of weird thing happening in front of them and just asking why, and I really do feel like that is the thing that makes us all human, and it's great, and it's just this constant pursuit of knowledge and just being able to refine. And I don't also really like using the word refining knowledge, because then, oh, hey, confirmation bias is peeking over the corner, right? It's oh, well, this sort of information is acceptable to me, but it's just being able to really know, okay, what can I use? And then there's And then there's the whole other philosophical question of, oh, wisdom and knowledge. Like, knowledge is knowing tomatoes are fruit. Wisdom's knowing not to put in fruit salad.
That's a good point, that there is a sense of nobility and a sense of humility. You've raised another interesting point there in the concept of disproving. As simple as it sounds, this is also where science can show weakness, because what does it mean to disprove? We assume we know what disproving means. It means demonstrating that an idea is not true. But we can use different approaches to disprove an idea. But then we have to ask ourselves, does disproving an idea according to those approaches objectively mean that those ideas are not actually truthful or that we shouldn't act on them? To give an example, our current scientific paradigm suggests that instead of trying to demonstrate that an idea is true, we try to disprove that it is not true. So we call that falsification. The rationale being that if we attempt to demonstrate that our hypothesis or our prediction is true, then there's a risk that we may inadvertently seek and pay attention to all the evidence that suggests that it is true, but then ignore the evidence that suggests that it's not, a la confirmation bias. But if we instead try to calculate the likelihood that it is not true, that then means that we have actually sought evidence to the contrary on purpose. And if we seek evidence to the contrary on purpose and then find that that evidence still suggests that it is not untrue, then it provides a tentative conclusion that it may be true. That avoids the confirmation bias. Then you have to also ask on top of that, but how do you calculate, in real world terms, the likelihood of something not being true? Yes, we have significance testing and various different forms of statistical analyses that calculate a hypothetical number that states the likelihood of something being true or not true. But then you have to ask again, can numbers actually capture the complexity of reality? And all too often what may happen is we may come to the conclusion that yes, the numbers say that this idea is highly unlikely to be true. But then what if the domain or the issue which you're examining there is so pivotal that society could run in wildly different ways depending on whether you assume it's true or not true? And then if you assume based on numbers that it is true or it is untrue, but then the actual opposite answer is the case and it's just that the numbers couldn't capture its complexity, then it has some pretty serious consequences. I know that it happens, I can almost guarantee that it happens in the realm of social psychology, but something closer to home for me is in the realm of psychotherapy. There are plenty of psychotherapists out there who follow the methods that they're taught to the letter, and they're still incompetent. I've known plenty of people in my professional and personal life who have had massively harmful experiences in therapy. I myself have had harmful experiences in therapy with my own history of mental illness, where I went to countless different psychotherapists over the years. They probably followed the theories that they were taught perfectly, but they still didn't achieve a logical or helpful outcome. Because just because in a large number of scientific studies, they were able to disprove the likelihood of a particular therapy not being effective, and thereby they could conclude from that, yes, this therapy is likely to be effective. The numbers can't also give you the richness of explaining, yes, this methodology is effective, but you must have these particular qualities to implement it well. You must be able to know when not to implement it. You must be able to know when these particular techniques should and shouldn't be used. You should be able to discern between the theory that drives this and the actual practice that we've suggested here. Sometimes the theory that drives the therapeutic method might be completely accurate, but you need to implement it in wildly different ways to what is suggested in the literature. It could still be accurate, it just needs to be modified heavily depending on your client base. So you're right that it's definitely noble, and part of that nobility is that we have to also be willing to question things regardless of how established they are.
Yeah, no, this ties directly into one of my favorite quotes, right? Actually, funny enough, the place I got this wasn't from some sort of textbook. It wasn't in lecture. No, it was from a meme where it was like, just remember, the odds of this very wacky, weird thing happening are very low, but never zero. And that's why, I remember going into college, my first real, especially my first STEM, science class, right? I believe it was biology, where they're like, listen, these are theories, right? Like, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter how established you think it is. It's a theory simply because the odds of it not being true are very low, but they're also never zero. Like, who's to say, what if one day, for some reason, gravity fails? Like, gravity goes away. Everything we know about it changes. Like, I'm not saying that could happen, but it's like it also can't happen. And then we also go into when you're going back to the topic of disproving, it's like, we got to consider, okay, who has the burden of proof now, right? Especially when it comes to, okay, hey, you have a theory, I don't think it's very sound. Is it now on them to further, have the burden of proof to like solidify that their theory is sound, or is it now on me, the person not offering to the conversation other than just, being a credit, or like just basically if there's positive feature, there's negative feature, it's like, okay, so is it me who has the burden of proof now? Because going back to the Sagan standard of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, I guess that's also something, most folks have to consider is like, okay, who has the bigger burden of proof?
I would say that in a society in which all of us have to work together to make society work, all of us have the burden of proof. It's very easy to assume if someone makes a wildly outlandish or ridiculous sounding claim, to us at least, it's easy to assume they have the burden of proof. But that depends largely on the context. Sometimes all it takes is for a person to question an established scientific theory, for people to then defensively call them a conspiracy theorist and say, well, you made the claim, you need to prove it. First of all, by the way, folks, there's no such thing as proof in science. Proof only exists in mathematics. We have evidence. We have to evidence it. We have to demonstrate it through evidence. But in instances where we're questioning the validity of what we assume to be established, I think we all have the burden of proof. We all have to be willing to ask that same question, because it could affect all of us and it could affect our neighbours as well. I would say to humble ourselves in the way that in the spirit of science really suggests to, we should say, whenever there is a possibility, we all have the burden of proof to ponder it.
Going back to the idea where, okay, yes, it's good we have this high threshold for credible information, but it's if most of our knowledge is coming from places that require some sort of, tuition to enter, is it really that credible as well?
If this is what you meant, it raises the question of, is the tuition itself providing those involved a sound basis on which they can make their claims?
Because it's like, I'm pretty sure, right? So to be able to publish, I think you're going to need some sort of credibility to what you're saying, right? Because if you're peer reviewing, it's like, okay, where am I getting this paper from? Am I getting this from an actual institution where someone did go through the quote unquote proper, steps to do this? If the only people that are really able to push to like, push their information out are coming from like colleges, it's like, okay, but what happens to like, what if someone else has like a very good idea that could be sound and very, very testable? They just can't afford to go to school. What then,
Indeed, and the fact that money and credibility have to be involved in it inevitably will exclude some people who do have ideas worth exploring.
I guess, and that's where you could make the argument like, oh, okay, well, what if we just reform education? But it's just when you have to think about practicality, it's who would be the best possible voices, right? Because in an ideal society, it'd be meritocracy where, oh, well, if you really did have those good ideas or, the intellect to be able to come up with that, you should be able to get into a college for free. But then, as some of your listeners may know, especially if they are coming from like, the United States, it's not always like that, right? Where a lot of factors go into scholarships, unfortunately, where it really does seem that intellect alone might not even get you there. Like I had to actually I had to put myself on the line for 4 years to be able to go to school. Like if I didn't have that benefit through the Veterans Administration, I probably would have never stepped foot on a college campus. So yeah, it's just something else to ponder.
Well, Kouta, this has been a fascinating discussion, and as I've said, science affects us in all ways. Even if one is not a scientist themselves, we live in a society the workings of which are greatly influenced by scientific findings. And I want to really thank you for contributing your thoughts today and your arguments, because everyone needs to know more about the way that our society operates, and science is a big part of that. And your life experience has evidently given you a great amount of insight into how we can best assess these matters.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It really, really was a pleasure. I never thought that someone would want to hear from me being like just coming straight out of undergrad, but I'm glad that I was able to just have my day in the sun and just be able to, express like, hey, this is what's going on. Like this is the room check on the ground. And so I'm very, very grateful to have been on the show today. Thank you.
The pleasure is mine, Kouta, and I hope to see your voice in more podcasts and perhaps even having your own podcast one day because you have things that are evidently worth saying. And to our audience, thank you everyone for joining us. As usual, please remember that anything that you find on the internet or in the media is not advice. If you have concerns for yourself or somebody else, please seek advice from somebody that you trust. If you are seeking counselling in Australia and want to find me, my contact details are in the description of this episode. And if you have any ideas of your own, whether you'd like to be a guest on my podcast, whoever you may be, if you have suggestions for topics that you'd like to hear discussed, especially if you disagree with something that I've said and you'd like to challenge it, please feel free to contact me. I always love hearing from my audience. And until next time, everybody, take care.